to the Youth Culture Seminar. I'm going to be looking at the history and dynamics of youth culture in this seminar. Okay, in this session, let's look at just one really interesting phenomena: hairstyles. If you think of the 60s and 70s, you think of long hair. Cultural values are expressed in many ways, and one of them is fashion, and specifically hair fashions. So for us in the boomer generation, hair was very, very significant. In fact, you may remember the musical called Hair. It came out in 1968. Now, by then, a whole set of people had already started growing their hair long, but it became really significant for the whole of the country as it moved in from the coasts to the Midlands and from the city into the country. What you found is more and more dads saying, "When are you going to get a haircut?" Dads were World War II vets. They were used to wearing their hair short because when you're at war, you want to avoid fleas and lice and ticks and other things like that. And so they grew up with shorter hair. But now suddenly men were growing their hair long. You remember the song? Give me a head with hair. Long, beautiful hair. Shining, gleaming, streaming, flaxen, waxen. Give me down to there, shoulder length or longer, hair. Here, baby, there, mama, everywhere, daddy, daddy, hair, hair, hair. The musical Hair was huge. Unsurprisingly, it was first staged in New York City because it was a study of hippie culture in the New York City area. And they had a set of things that they stood for, and those things that they stood for gradually overtook American culture. If you look at it, you see how the subject of the musical became key areas in youth culture. So, for example, anti-Vietnam War, that was part of what Hair stood for. Racism and combating racism was one of the things that the Hair stood for. Anti-materialism, you look at the jeans and the sweatshirts, but also the outrageous colors and dynamic, lively, vivid colors that people were wearing, and the styles, how much they changed. All this was a result of that culture, as was the sexual revolution. Much of that came at that time, and it was reflected in the musical on stage. It was the first popular musical that had nudity in it. Live nudity. It was also into the questions of the environment and pollution. And Hair was breaking down the gender stereotypes of the day as well. Men wearing long hair. Now, it's helpful to remember that this was in the time of the Equal Rights Amendment being in the public eye as well, in the early 70s especially. But here's the interesting question. So is this the first time that hair was used as a key cultural statement, or it summed up something significant that was going on in youth culture? The answer to that is no, it isn't the first time. The 1920s were actually quite similar. It was a time of huge cultural shift. Now, let's take a quick look at the context. Remember, early 1920s, turn of the late teens and into the 20s, you had the 19th Amendment. So women received the right to vote. You also had the Prohibition Amendment, and that brought alcohol off of the streets into the speakeasies. It sent it underground, and it made the access to it more of an act of rebellion, but it didn't stop it. World War I was just over with all of its carnage and its horror. The film industry was just getting popular. It was rising rapidly, and in fact, this is the era in which you started to see the starlets having big names in newspapers. They became the elite of American culture about this time. Clothing was becoming more affordable, and that meant that young women especially started to wear styles that their mothers and grandmothers absolutely disapproved of, because they were they were much more sexual than what their parents and their grandparents were used to wearing or did wear. And you all know the term flappers and the Charleston, the dance of the time. You saw youth culture in a big moment, a big time of advancement for all sorts of reasons. But now let's go back to hair. So I said hair. Why hair? Very interestingly, in the 1920s, one of the big things that happened was women started bobbing their hair. That means getting it cut short. You had the Dutch cut that was down here in the straight bangs. You had the various kind of, I can't describe all of these things, but they were all forms of having bobbed hair. And it was making a statement by young people to their parents' culture. It was rejecting the view that women should wear their hair long or have long hair until they are married. So it was tied into courtship, sexuality, and all sorts of other things that were changing in the 1920s. Not surprisingly, where did it come from? It came from Hollywood and the fashionistas of the day. If you recognize the name Clara Bow, she would be one of the ones who's first to bob her hair, as did someone named Irene Castle or Louise Brooks or Colleen Moore. These are the stars of that era, and they all got their hair bobbed. Now, even more interesting, if you follow the writing of F. Scott Fitzgerald at all, you know that one of his short stories was called Bernice Bobs Her Hair. It was written in 1920 and appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. And it's very fascinating because it came out right at the time where this was an issue. Should women bob their hair? Should they not bob their hair? Young people saying yes, older people saying no. Bernice Bobs Her Hair is a short story about a country girl from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, who goes away to college, and she's there influenced to cut her hair, to bob her hair. And in the story, she's kind of debating, should I or shouldn't I? And what you saw was that she was struggling with acceptance and rejection, with popularity, with jealousy, with all these things that are so much part of youth culture. But the book itself, the short story itself, captured something about youth culture, saying this is what's going on. And at the time, it was like somebody just pulled back the curtains on a new thing that's happening amongst young people. Today, we look at this and go, popularity, rejection, jealousy, betrayal, acceptance, identity, all that stuff's youth culture today. But it wasn't in 1920. So you see this thing going on with a hairstyle that was part of, an expression of, the bigger culture that was going on amongst young people as they were looking at what had their parents established as the way of life and as culture. And they were saying, we are starting our own. We're setting our own styles, our own fashions, and we're doing things in our own way. So, give me a head with hair, long, beautiful hair, or give me a head with short hair, bobbed hair. In either case, they were making a statement.